Welcome, my students, to a quick lesson on graphing. At this point, you should have your note sheet out and ready to go. Okay, if you don't, pause this and then go get it. All right, so the first thing, this is a good review on variables. You may remember from the scientific method notes, we have our dependent variable and our independent variable. We said that the dependent variable, again, is what you are measuring, and it depends on the independent. So at this point in time, you want to pause the video and get this information in your notes. The next variable is the independent variable. Again, you may remember from the scientific method notes, this is what independent, change. And so again, this is what you're changing in the experiment, and the dependent depends on this. So again, pause the video and get this written in your notes. So why do we need to review these things? Well, it comes down to making graphs. Both your dependent and independent variable will be involved when you do your graphing. So when we make graphs in this class, there's going to be a total of 3 things you need to remember. So the title is what goes on top of your graph. Down here is a sample of a graph that we are looking at. So the 3 things we need to remember is that your title can be the same as the data table. It should always go on top, and it should include your dependent and your independent. If you look at this title, it's very simple, but exercise is what we were changing, so that's the independent, and pulse rate is what we were measuring, so that's my dependent. So notice both are in the title. Again, you might need to pause this video to get this information written down. Next thing you need to remember when you're making graphs is you need to put your labels on your axes. Now when we are making graphs, our independent always goes on the x-axis, which is the horizontal one down here. And the dependent variable always needs to go on the y-axis, which is what you have going this way, vertical. And so again, dependent, what you're measuring, goes on the y. Independent, what you're changing, goes on the x. And you need to make sure you label them. So for example, pulse rate was our dependent, and we have a nice detailed title or a label for it, pulse rate in beats per minute. And then down here we have a good title for our x-axis, which is the time. This is what we were changing. In this case, it's actually not the exercise, kind of weird, but the time in minutes. So again, that's what was being changed. At this point in your notes, at number 3, you will need to write this down. Every once in a while, you're going to need a key or a legend. Down here is a key or a legend that's telling us what each different line stands for. So this green line right here with the squares is Albert, and I can tell by the key. And then the diamond shape, the red line right here, is for Mabel. So why do we need to do this? Well, we measured 2 different people doing this experiment. So if we had 3 different people, we would need 3 lines, 4 different people, 4 lines, and we need to have a key to indicate that. So in our class, we're going to have a total of 3 types of graphs we're going to work with. This right here is a line graph. It's called a line graph because it looks like a line. And pretty much all you do is you put a little dot. You look at, in this case, it would have been the year, and then we looked at the wage and we put a dot. And then we would do the next year and the wage and put a dot, and when you're done, you just connect all of the dots. We will be practicing these in class. The best time to use a line graph is when you're dealing with time, in this case the year, on your x-axis. It's a good time to use a line graph. Another type of graph that is good to use in science class is what we call a bar graph. Bar graphs are great when you're working with categories down here like you see on your x-axis. So this time when you make a bar graph, instead of putting a dot wherever your category and your dependent meet, you make a bar. And then that way you don't have to connect dots at the end. Third type of graph we make in here is what's called a pie graph, also known as a circle graph. This is great when you are working with percentages. But I had you write down some things to remember here, so write these down in your notes, because these are the areas people mess up on. If you have a category that's 50%, it should look like half the circle. It shouldn't look like just a part of the circle. And also, you want to include your labels, because if you don't have labels, then how do I know what this stands for? Now, these people here put a label over here by making a key. Again, we will practice these in class. So let's see what you learned and do a little bit of practice. So what's bad about this graph? Well, I can tell you right now, it needs a title. Where is it? It needs labels. And it needs labels over here. So really bad graph. It's a line graph, but I have no clue what it's showing. Now here it does say days, but what are the days? And here it says percent, but what are the percents? Plus, if you're dealing with percentages, shouldn't you use a pie graph, possibly? Maybe. Okay, here's another line graph. What's bad about this graph? Yep, you said it. It's missing a title. In this case, always good to have your independent and dependent in the title. So you could say games played versus total profit. So I have my independent and dependent all in one title, and that would make an excellent title. And lastly, we have the pie graph here. This pie graph is great in that we have percentages, but what do they stand for? Plus, we are missing a title. So what is the 37.5? What is the 12.5? Are we talking about sports? Are we talking about music? What are we talking about? We don't have labels. So that's your little lesson on graphing.